Within our party, we have a range of voices and perspectives on some pretty big issues, including around the Middle East. And it is really, really important, and indeed it's a great strength of this party, that here in this room we can have deep and serious and difficult conversations about how to move forward, how to support Canadians, how to...
The Prime Minister delivering a message to his caucus gathered in Ottawa today, rallying the troops ahead of the House of Commons return Monday, and against the backdrop of swirling questions around his own leadership of the Liberals. This week, Newfoundland and Labrador Liberal MP Ken McDonald openly mused about the Prime Minister reaching his quote-unquote best before date and voiced support for a leadership review. 24 hours later, and after a meeting with the party's whip, McDonald insisted, quote, "The intent of my recent public comments was not to personally call for a leadership review, and I am not calling for one now." Despite the pronounced walk back, is the political damage already done? Let's bring in the front bench to talk about that. Former BC Premier Christy Clark, she's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. Former Toronto Mayor John Tory is here, as a CTV News' political analyst, and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair. Hi, everybody. Great to see you. And I'm glad that I have the three of you who have all at some point had to wrestle with people talking about your leadership or ultimately coming to a decision yourself. Christy, I'll start with you. What does it say to you that MPs are even saying that stuff out loud? Or that
It's not a good sign. It's never a good sign. You know, I've been through something like that myself, I have to say. And, you know, once somebody breaks the seal on the conversation, it never goes away. That doesn't mean it's, you know, sudden death or anything like that. But it means that the conversations are going to heat up a little bit. People are going to start feel more confident about saying things. And, you know, I'm not sure Justin Trudeau has a great relationship with his caucus. Rumor has it he still doesn't know everybody's name, and many of them have never spoken to him in the entire time they've been elected. This is the moment where people like Brian Mulroney or Jean Chrétien would tell you their relationships with caucus are really important. And I don't think Trudeau's really got the backup in caucus that he needs. So not a good sign, not a death knell, but he's going to have some work ahead of him that wasn't ahead of him last week.
To Christy's point, John, I really noted today, listening to the full address to caucus, the kind of name dropping that occurred that isn't usually par for the course. And, you know, there has been a lot of reporting. There have been MPs who behind closed doors or ministers who left who talk about a lack of personal relationships. It was like the first page of Bill Morneau's book, for example, between themselves and the Prime Minister. Do you think that sort of talking about their achievements and giving them shout outs today is a nod to sort of the strategy that Christy is talking about?
No question. But I mean, as she made reference to Brian Mulroney, and I was in many of those caucus meetings when I was helping him back in the day. He did that every meeting for the entire time he was in government, because he knew that, you know, those relationships, especially in tough times, which did come for him when they slipped down into single digits in the polls. And it took the longest of times in those bad days for them, for caucus to show any signs of disquiet, because I think he really managed that. Look, I don't count Mr. Trudeau out, and I agree with Christy, it's not a death knell, but it certainly is a turning point, because all three of us have been party leaders. We've all been through trying to manage the party and the caucus and so on. And when you have somebody that goes public like this has happened, it is a turning point, because what it leads to, for example, and you were alluding to this, is, you know, all kinds of surveys that will now be undertaken. And of course, if you get the survey and you're a Liberal MP and you don't answer, you know, that by itself is not good. I mean, for the leader. And so it puts all those things into play, whereas up until now, we've had rumors and reports of caucus discussions inside, but nobody coming out and talking about it. I thought it was sort of hilarious, really, that the guy said, well, I didn't really mean that, and I would have loved to have seen the conversation that led to that. But having said that, it's done, and now the question is, what is the consequence of that? But you can't see it as other than a serious turning point in this entire discussion that's gone on for some time in different ways.
Yeah, does the walk back matter, Tom, politically? Because as John alluded to, like, it was literally, he explicitly said a leader, you know, his support, he expressed his support of a leadership review, and then said the polar opposite in that statement that he released.
You weren't supposed to notice that it was the polar opposite. I'm not so sure he was walking it back as he was avoiding walking the plank. It was amazing, because he's a pretty gutsy character, and I was really surprised. You know, it was head down. Oh, no, I never really meant to say that. Who said that? That was my internal voice that somehow made it out. But this is something that those of us who have gone through know is the beginning of something that will snowball. Once somebody has allowed themselves to get out there, and by the way, I disagree slightly with Christy on one thing. I think Trudeau's pretty darn good at interpersonal communications. I think his one-on-ones, he's held on to his caucus pretty darn well, except when it blew up over Israel and Gaza. And he's even addressing that today. I'll give you one detail from today that was a bit of a tell for me. He's a tremendous communicator. He's not Donald Trump. He knows how to read off a teleprompter. He slipped any number of times. I was like you, Vash. I watched the whole thing. And it was uncharacteristic for Trudeau to be slipping. What that told me was that this beta version of an eventual campaign attempt was something that he had basically been given right away. Usually, when you're in a position like that, you've practiced your speech several times. You don't want to have slips. So for me, this was the Liberals saying, okay, we've got a room, we've got applause people. You're going to say stuff, and they're going to applaud at every applause line we give you. But that's not Trudeau either. He's never had to depend on that. So these are the little things that are telling me that his ascendancy over his caucus and his cabinet perhaps are starting to slip. You mentioned Bill Morneau's book. I think that's an important thing. Morneau took a while to come out with, but he had really a lot of elbow room. He wasn't beholden to anybody. I'm anxious to see if David Lametti, he's going to be at a big law firm. Maybe he's bound to be a little bit more discreet. But I bet you he's got a few tales to tell. We tend to forget that we've now seen Trudeau fire 2 justice ministers in a row. Jody Wilson-Raybould, and then David Lametti. It's something I've never seen in my lifetime in Canada.
Well, he'll be on the show in about 10 or 15 minutes, so I'll ask him very explicitly. Christy, I thought what was also interesting was what Ken McDonald said out loud about the sentiment of his constituents, which was sort of a specific way of demonstrating what we have seen borne out in public opinion polling, that the state of the economy, that the cost of living crisis is really being pinned on the government. I had Steve McKinnon, the government House Leader, on earlier, and he seemed to insinuate that, look, it's just bad economic conditions and people will blame governments for that. Do you think that there's, a way out for them beyond just hoping the economy gets better? Like, should they be putting more stuff on the table, or is it so closely associated now with the Prime Minister that this stuff will stick?
Well, I think if the economy gets better and inflation goes down, interest rates go down, I mean, that's certainly going to have a positive impact for the current government. But, the problem is the longer a government's in power, the more record they have that they've created that they need to defend. And, he's got 10 years of record now. It's a solid, or not quite 10, it's a solid record, and solidly long, I should say, but not necessarily solidly strong in the eyes of many voters. I mean, people are looking for a break on housing. They're looking for a break on their housing costs. They're looking for cheaper groceries. The federal government can't control all that in any case. And for some things like housing, it's going to take a long time to fix. So they own their record now. You can't communicate your way out of a record. And the one thing they are good at is communication. They don't have a lot of, I guess, good policy chops to fall back on. They haven't shown a lot of strength at actually changing much in Canada. So I'm not sure they have the tools to fix this problem that they've got. Having said that, though, Vashi, because I know where you're going with it, could they win the next election despite that? I still think, given the way they won the last election with the smallest plurality in Canadian history and an incredible election machine, I still think it's possible.
We kind of got some other hints about the strategy, John, that they're going to employ to what Christy's talking about. Beyond, whether or not the question of whether or not they put anything new on the table to address affordability. It sounded to me from Minister McKinnon's interview like they're going to spend a lot of time trying to contrast themselves with the Conservatives. And that was certainly present today when they were talking about Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News personality, being alongside the Premier of Alberta, and really tying that to Pierre Poilievre and saying, you've got to denounce her appearance and the kinds of things that Tucker Carlson talks about. Do you ultimately think that will be successful for them?
Well, it'll help them if it's done in a kind of a measured way, but they still need, back to the points Christy and yourself were making, that they still need to have that improvement in the economy, because if it doesn't, it's problematic for them. They still need to stop these kinds of stories. I mean, today the Conservatives have very, skillfully again gone back to the sort of Nazi invitation to Parliament story, which is, you'd think would be sort of a dead issue by now in the sense that it just is, and sort of said, what did the Prime Minister have to do with that? And the answer is probably nothing, but it still conjures that up, and that can't can't be the stuff that's appearing on the news all the time. And then as for Tucker Carlson, I place little. I mean, to me, this is show business. I can't imagine why anybody would want to appear on television with him. I mean, he's a guy that said the demonstrators on January 6th on Capitol Hill were meek and elderly. You could ask the families of the people who died about that. He said that, the immigration made the U.S. poorer and dirtier. I mean, this is somebody where, maybe Danielle Smith, the premier, wants to be involved with him. And I sort of think trying to make him an issue is not going to work for anybody, including for the Liberals. They've got to get the economy going. They've got to stop this stream of bad stories. And they have to deal with irritants like the fact that if they're going to supply some money, which they will, because they did every year when I was mayor for the refugees, get on with writing the check, send it, stop the story from being in the news every day. And so to me, that's more going to get them onto a reset, which I think is a large number of caucus members, I'm told, actually think if they could have a successful reset, that they actually, could go forward with him. And I believe that's entirely possible, like Christy said. I mean, he's a fighter and they've got a machine and, you can't rule them out.
Tom, last word to you on that. There's some polling from Angus Reid this week that showed 2/3 of Canadians who were looking to vote Liberal wanted to do so to stop the Conservatives. Do conversations about people like Tucker Carlson advantage the Liberals in that situation?
I think we're overestimating the extent to which a personality like that from the United States coming in for a single event has an impact on the average working Canadian family. They're worried about pocketbook issues, the types of stuff that Poilievre's good about talking about. I disagree slightly with my colleagues that if the numbers stay anywhere where they are now, that Trudeau has a real chance of winning the next election. And that's why I do think that you're starting to see things break apart a little bit in caucus, people starting to talk about it. Because we're talking about what's going to go on in the caucus room. But when people break away and they go off for drinks after a caucus meeting, that's when the real stuff starts to happen. So I'm not putting a lot of stock in this, trying to make them, the Conservatives look like MAGA. But I think that the Liberals are still looking for what their theme is. Today's speech was a cornucopia. It was a kitchen sink speech. Absolutely everything was in there. There's some rah-rah stuff, we're the best in the world and all that. I think the Canadians are just hoping for something fresh. And what those polling numbers are showing to me is that people are not necessarily turning their backs on the Liberals, but they're actually, I think Ken McDonald had it right, that little sticker on the loaf of bread, the best before date. I think that there are people starting to communicate that in his 9th year in power now, he should consider doing the same type of thing that Jean Chrétien did. Set a date a little bit further on, get your legacy in there, start doing your stuff, but hand it off to somebody else and maybe you'll still have a fighting chance.
Okay, on that note, I'll leave it. Appreciate the discussion as always tonight, everyone. Christy Clark, John Tory, and Tom Mulcair, our front bench. We'll take